Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'd like to exclusively discuss the logos with you. Now, to lead in with a premise being defined as a previous statement or proposition from which another is inferred or follows as a conclusion, we're going to keep in mind that humans are superior pattern recognition creatures. That is, our minds, like no other animal on this planet, have an uncanny ability to search out and recognize patterns. Patterns of life, patterns in nature, patterns in music, patterns in color, and patterns of conduct. It is only a matter as to what degree an individual can recognize the patterns set out before their ears, eyes, and minds that becomes proportional to their understanding. In fact, the National Institute of Health tells us that, quote, superior pattern processing is the essence of the evolved human brain. So today, I'm going to attempt to hone your mind in on the patterns inherent within the invisible fractal that is unfolding before your very eyes at this very moment. And I'm going to attempt to show this to you using logic alone. Having said this, please keep this premise of pattern recognition in mind as we go through the following slides. So, in order for us to understand logic, we must first define logic, and thus the question is posed. Hi Q, what is logic? And the answer, quite simply stated, is that it is the science of correct reasoning. Logic is seen as the purest form of reason, or the defining form of reason. Now, reason, wait a minute, I like to use the Greek word for reason. Logos is a type of thought. Other types are judging, concept formation, problem solving, deliberation, idea consideration, memory, and imagination. And logic or reason or logos describes a system of formal rules for appropriate reasoning. Now, the oldest surviving written record to explicitly consider the formal rules by which reason operates are the works of Aristotle. And you may find it interesting to know that it is this exact question between Aristotle and Plato that led to Aristotle's departure from Plato's academy, where Aristotle went on to form his own school of peripatetics. But for now, we will shelve the details of this argument concerning the role of reasoning in confirming the truth, and instead focus on the tool identified and agreed upon by both Plato and Aristotle to confirm truth. And this tool was called nous, which means awareness or consciousness. Thus, consciousness or nous is the tool used to apply the faculty of correct reasoning or logic in order to confirm truth. Okay, now that we have defined logic or correct reasoning, we must understand the methods of reasoning, also known as the methods of argumentation, or even more succinctly stated, how to correctly argue. And the methods of reasoning are inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. Now, the deductive reasoning is superior because it is more formal and thus leads to certain truth, while inductive reasoning is a more informal type of logic and uses critical thinking to come to a probable truth. So let us begin by focusing on inductive reasoning. Now, the textbook definition of induction is that it is a form of inference producing propositions about unobserved objects or types, either specifically or generally, based on previous observation. It is used to ascribe properties or relations to objects or types based on previous observations or experiences, or to formulate general statements or laws based on limited observations of, here we go, recurring phenomenal patterns. Well, wait a minute. Persuasions? Assumptions? Opinions? Generalizations? Does this sound like the truth? And yet, this is exactly how academic science, better known as the scientific method, works. Through inductive reasoning. Let me explain all of this in common language. Science says, let me bang two rocks together and then notices a clacking sound. Then hits the rocks together 100 times and produces the same clacking sound. Finally, it makes the leap and says, I bet if I hit these two stones together again, the next time I do this, it will also produce a clacking sound. Clack. I can now state as a general principle that, quote, hitting two rocks together will produce a clacking sound. And yes, it is so easy that a caveman could do it. Now, to be fair, this is an extremely simplified version of the process of science. And I admire the brilliance of many scientists, but nonetheless, this is the scientific process, which is conclusive proof that the scientific process, which works off of induction, itself being nothing more than persuasion, is completely inferior to deductive reasoning. For even in the best or strongest cases of inductive reasoning, the truth of the premise does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. And in common language, this is called a swag, or a scientific wild ass guess, because the conclusion of an inductive argument follows with some degree of probability, which is why inductive reasoning only leads to probable truths, which is also called a verisimilitude or truth likeness, which is the notion that some propositions are closer to being truer than other propositions, but by no means is it a certain truth. Now, this type of logic is the breeding ground for bad ideas, and from a psychological point of view, results in a state of mind where you think you know the truth because you have accepted this partial truth as actual, factual, absolute truth. This is because it can be actuated and is based off of facts, and as such, the utility of it being used in this reality seduces or persuades the mind to accept it, which takes the simplified form of, quote, well, that's good enough for me because if it works, then that means I don't have to. To give you a practical example, the first bad idea we'll introduce is the mental disease called atheism, in which an atheist, using induction, will only skim the surface of religious literalism in order to easily pick them apart, because, hey, that's good enough for me. Where they fail is to apply the hermeneutical approach, because this would ultimately defeat the conclusion to the answer that they have already convinced themselves of, which betrays and reveals what their heart secretly desires to be true. In other words, they are looking for God to be not real, and so they find it. For you see, atheists are not looking for the absolute truth. They are looking for their particular version of inductive or persuasive truth that supports their desired conclusion. And in this regard, they are no better than a religious zealot, as they are merely on opposite ends of the spectrum of inductive reasoning, which amounts to a swag or simply an opinion. Moreover, atheism leads to parody religions, which mock and ridicule people's spiritual beliefs. And I think Plato said it best in Book 7 of the Republic that these immature minds are like puppies that delight at tearing at anything that comes close to them simply for the sheer joy of it. Now, a more in depth dive into atheism will be warranted for a future presentation, so I will shelve this topic for the moment in order to continue the line of thought on what else inductive reasoning produces. And the next thing I can think of is that on a macro level, it produces the paradigm. Now, what is a paradigm? Well, I'm glad you asked. A paradigm is a distinct set of concepts or thought patterns, including theories, research methods, postulates, and standards for what constitutes legitimate contributions to a field. Etymologically, the word paradigm means, here we go, a pattern to point out. In other words, a paradigm is nothing but a framework in which society operates, and that framework is composed of an educated guess, or rather a framework of educated guesses. And guess what? Academic science proceeds within such a paradigm. And the two most obvious paradigms I can think of are the paradigm of gravity and the paradigm of Earth. Now, before the theory of gravity came along, humanity had long known the science of density and buoyancy, and since the discovery and refinement of the knowledge of electromagnetism, we can put this phenomena in the pool of gravitational paradigms. All three explain the effect that we observe in the visible world, so which one is the truth? Or how about the paradigm of Earth? Did you know that there is not one single observational experiment that can detect the motion of the Earth? And no, I didn't just make this up. The heralded paragon of academic science did. How come they don't teach this to you in school? Now, if you think that the paradigm is bad, well, it gets much worse because the operating paradigm is what sets a culture up for something called social constructivism. So, what is social constructivism? Well, simply stated, social constructivism is where the ruling powers of a society decide that they can construct society however they deem fit because they own all the wealth and power. The most powerful method is by leveraging academia because the powers that be own academia and pay its bills, and tenure keeps the weak hearted man in line. Through the same mechanism, it also controls what information is allowed to be seen and thus allows control of what appears to be the truth. Social constructivism is not real truth. It is the most sinister kind of truth, which is manipulated and manufactured truth for the purpose of the selfish desires of wicked men. Social constructivism can be wrapped up in one sentence: I tell you what is true. Now you can see why out of place artifacts called OOPArts are so damning to the current paradigm, because they yank the social fabric up from under the feet of social constructivists. And so the powers that be push it back into the shadows in an attempt to blind you from questioning their version of the truth. Other consequences of social constructivism are inferior thoughts such as Common Core math and inferior social ideas such as gender fluidity. And the last time I checked, gender dysphoria is a DSM-5 code. All of these are the byproducts of social constructivism, which is the byproduct of an inferior paradigm, which is a byproduct of inductive reasoning, which is inferior to deductive reasoning, because inductive reasoning is found on persuasion, assumptions, opinions, and generalizations, and thus if you have no foundation, then your feet remain on shifting sands and your mind in a state of confusion, and anything goes, and as the old adage says, divide and conquer. So, to wrap up inductive reasoning, we can pose the question, hello Q, what is the end result of inductive reasoning? In other words, what is the product or byproducts of this line of thinking? And the unfortunate answer is that from a spiritual point of view, you get both the atheist and the zealot, as they are two peas in a pod and unfortunately just too ignorant to know it. And a zealot includes zealotry of all kinds. Now, from a cultural point of view, inductive reasoning gives you the paradigm, which is nothing more than a series of educated guesses compiled into a framework in order for a culture to function within. But hey, it works, so I'm good, right? And in the social sphere, this fallacious logic leads to social constructivism, where the ruling powers of a society decide I can bend the science or hide the things that don't support my view because I make the rules, not God. Now that you know this, shake the cobwebs out of your mind and look around. Don't you recognize this slide? You should, because it's the current paradigm of the world you live in. On the opposite end of the spectrum of logic, the science of deductive reasoning begins with a premise, which is a true or false statement in order to extract a necessary fact, and is then used to reach a valid conclusion. Now, the result of deductive reasoning is that the truth of the premises does guarantee the truth of the conclusion, which makes it valid, which is why, unlike inductive reasoning, which only leads to a probable truth, deductive reasoning leads to certain truth. Can you now see why Pythagoras said mathematics is the first science of God? Now I'm going to read you a select quote by a brilliant man named Terence McKenna. Please listen closely to what is said. Quote, our pride is in our mathematics, which is an intimation of the transdimensional object which is outside of historical phase space, and that casts an enormous flickering shadow over the human enterprise. It is through mathematics, through, first of all, the probability theory, more recently things like fractals and dynamic modeling. It is through these things that we are able to give a kind of empirical grounding to our visions, because what we see in our visions are not hallucinations. What we see in our visions is the higher truth, and we have never faced this. In fact, this is what we repress. Hallucinations are devalued. The phenomena of the mind are called subjective. This is a knock when you call something subjective. It means it's inconsequential, or it's a matter of opinion. We don't realize the primacy of mind. Science runs on induction, which is a very low-grade form of logic. It means you do something over and over again, and if it happens the same way 100 times, you have confidence that the 101st time it will happen the same way. Intuition does not work like that. Intuition leaves no trail. If someone claims intuition, our position is probably one of prove it. Doubt in the face of assertion, you see. But there's an interesting thing about intuition that I don't think many people understand or have bothered to look at, which is, did you know? I'll bet you didn't know. Mathematics is based on intuition. Now, half of mathematics would rise with a screech of horror at this statement, but the other half of mathematics itself has called itself intuitional mathematics. Okay, well, now what is going on here? Probably, if you are not a professional philosopher of science, you are accustomed to associating mathematics with science rather closely. This is because science, in order to give itself legitimacy, has very slyly appropriated mathematics, especially in the 20th century, to its purposes. But if we talk about what is called pure mathematics, which is the great love of mathematicians, it is an activity carried on in the mind based on deductive truth. Deductive, not inductive. In other words, a statement is made. It can be anything. All grays are non-X. This is just a statement. We don't yet know what this is going to be about. All grays are non-X. All greens are F sub 1. What we are putting in place are a set of statements that appear nonsensical, but what we will assert is that we should seek a relationship between them, and then that will show us something. And this is how mathematics really work. It has very little to do with number. It has to do with the conceptualizing of relationships, conceptualizing them, and then exploring your intuition about these conceptions. And then the third and very late stage is you write a formal statement of your cognitive activity around these assumptions. So you see, mathematics is entirely intuitional. It leaves no track. It is drawn from this other domain. Why has it been appropriated by science? Well, for a very fundamental and not well understood reason. Mathematics has been appropriated by science because mathematics has an uncanny ability to describe nature. Completely uncanny. Now, you may have never asked yourself, why is mathematics such a powerful tool for the description of nature? Maybe you thought that somebody else can answer this, but it's not a problem. Well, I've got news for you. It is a problem. Nobody has any good ideas about why mathematics describes nature. But notice that mathematics is an intuitional activity. An intuitional activity describes nature without the intercession of inductive science. Inductive science is a kind of naive holdover from Greek Democritian theories, where everything is conceived of as clearly conceivable and operating according to known laws. But in fact, the deeper structure of nature is not modeled after an examination of data obtained by measurement. That isn't how it works these days. The deeper description of nature is achieved by taking weird objects from the frontiers of mathematics, these things dreamed up in the confines and depths of the human mind and inside computers, and then laying them over nature and saying, my gosh, there's a one-to-one correspondence between, let us say, the multidimensional catastrophes described by Rene Thom and the dripping of a faucet, the turbulence in a brook, the voting patterns in a ghetto. All of these things are seen to be easily modeled by extremely exotic mathematical objects discovered through intuition within the mind. Well, what does this mean? Well, it means, if it means anything, and mean before we draw the deeper conclusion, what is the conclusion on the surface? It must be that the unaided human mind is more capable of correctly modeling nature than the human mind that works through the methodological inductive approach called science. I'll say that again. It must mean that the unaided human mind is more capable of correctly modeling nature than the human mind that works through the methodological inductive approach called science. And in fact, this is clearly true because in the world described by science, a scientific description of this room would say very little about all the important things going on in it. A scientific description of this room would leave out personality, would leave out linguistic intent, would leave out the uniqueness of each of us. For science, we're merely members of the human species, and again, this flattening, this reductionism, this betrayal of the quintessence of the phenomenon in a desperate attempt to achieve closure in the modeling process. And so then you do achieve closure, but the model is always inadequate, and there is this sense of frustration. We can't get closure with the model unless we tell a lie, unless we deny the complexity, the interrelatedness, the soulness, the spiritness, the mindfulness. All of these things are for science what are called secondary properties. Okay, so what is the path of intuition in relationship to nature that is different from the path of science? In a way, it's only a shift of emphasis. William Blake said, attend the minute particulars. This is very good advice for science, and it is very good advice for mathematics. And what I'm suggesting here tonight is that we have misconstrued mathematics and have bought the notion that it is part of science when actually it stands ready to empower intuition and sweep science, if not away, at least into a more proper role, more befitting its extremely limited application to the higher orders of reality that we really care about. I mean, science really is the plumbing level of reality. Now, within the realm of superior deductive reasoning, there's a branch called proposition logic, also called proposition calculus or zeroth order logic or modus ponens. It is deductive argument that takes the following form. If P, then Q, hello Q, P, therefore Q. And to change this into its formal notation, it would look as such. P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Now let us look at the most important example of this that I can think of, and that is the deductive statement that God is everything. Putting this statement in an expressive form using syllogistic logic looks as doth. If God is, then it must be everything. And you can also choose to view this as a mathematical formula, which God equals everything, or in its abstract formula of A equals B. And these are all different points of view of the same thing we are after, which is a provable certain truth. And this axiomatic statement is deductively valid, which equates to a certain truth. And transposing this into the point of view of a religious belief, this is called pantheism, which translates to all God, which is the belief that reality is identical with God. And since we know that the corollary opposite of pantheism is panentheism, which is God is outside of all, we can continue further and apply the material implicative classical operation of reductio ad absurdum, which is the form of argument that attempts to establish a claim by showing that the opposite scenario would lead to an absurdity or contradiction. And pantheism is certainly both a contradiction and an absurdity, because everything is, well, everything, and nothing can exist beyond everything. Because if something existed beyond everything, then everything would not be everything, which is contradictory and absurd. Therefore, deductively, we can affirm that pantheism is provably true, while its opposite, panentheism, is provably false. Thus, we can deductively prove that God is everything. Now, this becomes a tautological statement in that it is provably true in every possible interpretation. For the corollary opposite statement would be that God equals nothing, and this is provably false because nothing is just that, no thing. It has no quality or attribute, and we can mathematically prove this as 0 plus 0 equals 0, 0 minus 0 equals 0, 0 times 0 equals 0, and 0 divided by 0 equals 0, although technically indeterminate. Therefore, it is provable that nothing begets nothing, and you can certainly look around you and see that there is indeed something. This also becomes a tautological statement and is classically known as ex nihilo, or simply nothing comes from nothing. Now, using this simple tautological formula, A equals B, we can conclude this thought because science teaches us provably that everything is energy. Simply look into an electron microscope and see for yourself. And furthermore, science also tells us that energy is electromagnetism. And still further, science tells us that electromagnetism is light, which is the very conclusion that James Clerk Maxwell, known as the father of electromagnetism, concluded in his seminal paper. Therefore, all of these terms become equally tautologically interchangeable. Thus, God equals everything, equals energy, equals electromagnetism, equals light. And the world's religions agree with me, for their teachings tell you that God is the light. Thus, using deductive, formulaic logic and confirming the result in Scripture, the statement God equals everything is what I call a perfect statement in regard to an absolute truth. And this becomes an axiom or axiomatic in that it becomes self-evidently true without any need of proof. So the next time an atheist demands for you to prove it, just tell them that God is axiomatic or simply show them the deductive formulaic proof. But they won't do that because this would force someone's adolescent mind to think beyond skimming only the surface of literalism. Oh, by the way, the standard scientific symbol for light is Q. Hello, Q. And if they still don't get it, point them to the English alphabet and tell them to learn how to use it. Hello, Q, or Christ. So now that you can prove that God is an absolute truth, let us explore the next logical step, which is the principle of causality, also called causation, or cause and effect, or the sixth hermetic principle. Please note that causality is implicit in the logic and structure of ordinary language. Now, the object of causality, as defined by Aristotle, is to answer the question why. Why, which is certainly the most important of the five W's, because who, what, when, and where, and even how are ancillary in relation to the question why, as why gives you the purpose, which in turn gives you direction, which in turn gives you motivation. An example, let us ponder the Great Pyramids. To know who built them, what they are, when they were built, where they were built, and even how they were built are all inferior to the question of why they were built, which means that the question why is superior and the other four W's and an H are inferior questions. So let us take a look at the textbook definition of causality, which is influence by which one event, process, state, or object, a cause, contributes to the production of another event, process, state, or object, an effect, or the cause is partly responsible for the effect, and the effect is partly dependent on the cause. Now, if we use infinite logic, we can see that this establishes what is called a causal chain. And to put this into a simplified expression, it would read, every cause has an effect, and that effect becomes a cause to its effect, ad infinitum. Now look at this hierarchical logic diagram very closely, and we can see that a ratio is established, or the mean between two extremes. This is the sweet spot where, just as we define, is both partly responsible for the effect and partly dependent on the cause. And what this diagram sets up is called a mean analogy. And you can clearly see the linkage in the diagram is the mean, also called the pattern or the ratio. Wait a minute, I prefer to use the Greek word for ratio, and that is logos. Now that this is firmly established, and we have conclusively previously proven that God is, well, we know the ultimate cause of everything, that is God, which allows us to input this data into our diagram. And guess what is on the lower portion? You are. And still further, the Greeks define that power that draws you upward through the ratio or logos back to the source being God, and that power is eros or love. For God is the beautiful, and we as humans desire what is beautiful. We're attracted to the beautiful. We desire to know and experience and love that beautiful transdimensional resonance and participate in it and reciprocate its love. You are God in quality over quantity. You are ratioed God. You are the Logos. And this is the ultimate teleological answer, which is the study of the end reason. Why? Unconditional love. That's why. And still further, please understand that karma is just another term for cause and effect, only from the Eastern metaphysical point of view, because, using infinite logic, karma simply stated is that the intent of your action equals the consequence, and yes, it carries forward in your future lives, as you are a being who never dies. You live forever. Thou art it. Now, continuing with infinite logic, we will transfer from the two-term analogy of cause and effect in a hierarchical form and into a three-term analogy, which I will use the linear format for ease of reference. Note that the three-term analogy is also known as a mean analogy because the form A is to B as B is to C involves the mean term B opposed to the extremes A and C. And expanding the term throughout infinite logic, we can understand that this formula produces the infinite chain as well, such as C is to D as D is to E, E is to F as F is to G, and so on and so forth, which, here we go, establishes a perpetual pattern. And we know from the previous slide that a pattern, or the mean, or the ratio, is the logos. Now, of particular interest is that in this infinitely linear form, the three-term analogy is analogous with the operation of the human eye. In short, when the two-dimensional upside-down and reversed image composed of light hits the retina of your eye, photoreceptor cells turn the light into electrical signals, which then travel through the optic nerve and into the brain, which in turn converts the signal into a three-dimensional right-side-up image. Now, the image rate for your eye is approximately 60 to 72 frames per second, and understanding this physical operation leads to the metaphysical consideration that a frame is a static or frozen image. Thus, all actual movement must be happening between the frames captured by your brain. And this is in between space is again the logos. Consider that this flipbook holds the static images you see and perceive as motion, although in reality each frame is actually motionless. Now here is a profound and analogous question for you to ponder, and that is, who is the hand flipping the book? Now, inherent within the form of the three-term analogy are laws of transformation, just as a Cartesian coordinate system or the standard mathematical order of operations. And understanding the transformative properties of the three-term analogy will reveal a magnificent series of truths. So the first thing to understand is that in accordance with the laws of transformation, you can 1. Switch terms between the ratio, and 2. Connect terms between the ratio. And this equates to a total of 4 transformations within the three-term analogy. And those 4 transformations, to be specific, are A is to B as B is to C, B is to A as C is to B, B is to C as A is to B, and lastly C is to B as B is to A. Now the first thing I want you to notice is that this form intrinsically contains beauty, which is one of the legs of the Platonic Trinity. And the classic qualities of beauty are a sense of order, pattern, balance, and symmetry. And we will discuss these. So the first unique property is that it actually contains reflectional symmetry or mirror symmetry, which is a holomorphic quality. Next, you can see that the extreme terms become the mean terms for yet another linear symmetrical transformation. Thirdly, notice that it carries yet another linear symmetrical transformation within its quadrants. And a fourth, mirroring transformation, is also found within quadrant inversions, and also within a fifth and central form of inversion. And another unique property is that the original mean term of B circulates within the fourfold form and produces a two-dimensional circling of the square. You may also notice that the entire form is produced of only 3 letters, and yet unfolds into a perfect square composed of 16 individual letters, or 4 square. This encodes yet a second circling of the square, just as pi, which is 3.14 ad infinitum, finds itself within the natural numerical sequence between the 3 and 4. So what does all of this mean? Well, I want you to think back a moment to the previous ponderance of static images and the human eye. Now, superimposing only a few of these properties upon one another, you can clearly see for yourself the absolute astonishing discovery that the form of the three-term analogy has embedded within it a hypercube. In other words, I pointed out multiple two-dimensional static observations of holomorphic transformations in multiple views of circling the square embedded within the three-term analogy, and yet they are only static intimations of the fourth dimensional dynamic hypercube contained within this natural form of logic. And while you may have trouble comprehending all of this, or even visualizing the hypercube in its static form, from my eyes, those being the eyes of a person who claims to have truly attained enlightenment, whether waking or sleeping, it looks like this moving image all the time. And even this is a gross understatement, for this is the simplest way I know how to help you visualize the phenomena of actually attaining the fourth or fifth dimensional state of consciousness, depending on your point of view, or what the ancient Greeks knew as a hero, that is a divine man, being someone who is suspended somewhere between something more than a human but less than an immortal, and in specific a hero of the Jupiterian order, or what Plato called the attainment of the brilliant light of being, what the Christians call Christ consciousness, or being Christed, or becoming a Christ, or salvation, or what the Vedas call becoming the Brahman, or liberation, or knowing thyself. These are only a few examples of what it has been called by different cultures over the course of time. And moreover, analogies can take the form of numbers, symbols, letters, and even ideas. And even these are not limited in their own complexity. And as an example, if you think that the discovery of the hypercube within the form of the three-term analogy is astonishing, How does it feel to know that this is the exact analogical information embedded within the very structure of the Giza pyramids? Now, if you are finding that the form of the three-term analogy is complex, welcome to the world of the four-term analogy, which has 8 inherent transformations and continues into even more complex mathematical holomorphic transformations containing the inherent qualities of a fractal, such as translations, scaling, homotopy, similarity, reflection, rotation, and even shear mapping. By the way, here's an orthogonal projection of an 8 cube. Imagine how complex it gets as your mind moves into the 5-term analogy, 6 terms, 7 terms, infinite terms. Plato himself used an 8-term analogy in teaching you how to educate yourself as a philosopher king and wake up your brilliant light of being. In other words, he deemed it necessary to outline an educational analogy to the factor of 8 in order for you to become self-realized. Now you can only begin to imagine the complexity within the logos. And for simplification, I will cover only one point within the deductive logical framework of the 4-term analogy, and that is the fundamental proposition that is intrinsic within the logic of causation, which states that the cause is always superior to its effect. And you can clearly see that, as a human being, you are an effect of this earth or nature, which is the cause. Now, Alan Watts, in his usual playful and charming manner, shed great philosophical insight into this when he noticed that the apple looks nothing like the tree and yet blossoms into a tree in a never-ending cycle. And using this four-term analogy, just as the apple tree apples, so the earth peoples. Can you now understand why the ancient Greeks and even the Hermetics believed that you were an inverted plant or celestial plant with your root in the heavens, and that you have the power within yourself to become a star, as stars are the next higher order of light in the great chain of being? And having deduced the axiomatic or immutable truth that the cause is always superior to the effect, apply this deductive logic in regard to your own consciousness. For the logical conclusion must be that since you have consciousness, and using your consciousness, you know that you are an effect. That which is superior to you, being the earth, or if you prefer nature itself, must have superior consciousness in order to have grown you. You being a being with consciousness, or a conscious being. And you can prove this to yourself by simply observing natural law. For no matter how hard man may use his own consciousness in an attempt to break the universal laws, he finds that he is immutably bound by it. So now the only question that remains is, who or what consciousness greater than your own do you suppose created these universal laws? Now, throughout this presentation, we have discussed many things that are superior versus inferior. Beginning at the top with logos, or logic or reason, we can see that deductive reasoning, which is intuitive and metaphysical, is superior to inductive reasoning, which is observable and physical. And we can also see that deductive reasoning is superior as it leads to certain truth, while inductive reason is inferior, which only leads to a probable truth at best. The same goes for the analogy, which is the most fundamental element in Platonic and Neoplatonic thought, as the analogy is a demonstration which shows you by example versus an academic lecture, which is a controlled forcing mechanism of a one-way conversation which attempts to persuade or convince you by bending your will to its own. And we can see that intuition, which is based on insight, is superior versus emotion, which is based on instinct and thus inferior. And we also discussed the axioms of cause and effect, and in particular how your consciousness and effect must be inferior to nature's subtle yet superior consciousness, which is the ultimate cause. We also discussed that it is the why question that is superior to the other four W's and an H. Remember, why they built the pyramids is superior to who, what, when, where, and how. And in general, you may notice, here we go, that the pattern is such that the metaphysical world, which is invisible, is superior to the physical, visible or mundane world. Notice that it is the mind, which is a metaphysical thing, that rules over the body, a physical thing. And this is also true for the relationship of the five senses to the mind, for it is the senses that feed the mind, or conversely, the mind eats the sensory information. Thus, your five physical senses are inferior to your mind, even though both are metaphysical and visible things, which means that there must be an inherent hierarchical order within both the physical and metaphysical unfoldments. And finally, and as strange as this may sound to the rational mind, it is indeed true that the fantastic world or fantasy world is superior to the realistic world or real world, or what you call reality. And this is easily proven to be true. For everything you see around you that is made by human hands, buildings, roads, even entire societies, were all first conceived within the mind of man and secondarily manifested into reality. Equally, you can also look into an electron microscope and prove that at the fundamental level of reality, a physical thing, everything is energy, a metaphysical thing. This means that the metaphysical fantasy world is the underpinning to mundane reality. And for the second time in this presentation, Einstein and I both agree. Now I would like to isolate the opposition of the mental coordinator versus the mental reactor in order to unfold this avenue of thought a little further so that you may familiarize yourself with some of the basic functions of your mind. Now, deductive reasoning uses intuition, and intuition arises from that part of the psychic complex we call the sixth sense, or what the Buddhists call the mental coordinator, or what I call, here we go, the subconscious super pattern recognizer. Now, from a scientific point of view, the purpose of the mental coordinator is to compute the testimony of the sensory perceptions, and it does this by subconsciously digesting and assimilating all sensory evidence, then incorporating it into the permanent structure of human insight, which means that you are constantly adding to your store of knowledge, but are not aware of the process. And through hypnotic research, we know that every micro detail of your life is recorded. And from the cradle to the grave, the record is unbroken. Hypnotic research has also shown that this knowledge extends beyond your current incarnation and reaches into your past lives. Now, this functioning of the mental coordinator can be seen from the Judaic point of view as the Sephirot of Chokmah, or wisdom, which is associated with the god Yah, and which crowns the pillar of mercy in the Kabbalistic tree of life. From the Christian point of view, this equates to the book of life. And from a theosophist point of view, it is the Akashic record. And Carl Jung described this psychological phenomenon in more contemporary scientific language as the collective unconscious. So, how do we access the collective unconsciousness of our mental coordinator? Well, even though there is many paths to enlightenment, as there are people, there are also universalities that apply to all. The first thing we should notice is that intuition is an attribute of the type of person who is essentially mentally and emotionally honest. Good examples would be Edgar Cayce, Walter Russell, and Nikola Tesla. Thus, we should learn to be both honest with ourselves and with others, as this authenticity sets the conditions to synchronize your conscious thinking with the subconscious thinking of the coordinator. Secondly, we must learn to refrain from jumping to conclusions. That is, the objective mind arrives at immediate but superficial conclusions. And with this type of unchecked, superficial thinking, we're constantly interfering with our mental coordinator. The emotional thinker will inevitably become the hopeless victim to his own mental process and eventually become completely dominated and enslaved by his own emotional intensities. Thirdly, we should learn to be thoughtful. We should take the time to carefully think through the answers to the problems which we seek to solve. This thoughtfulness requires us to suspend the kind of knee jerk emotional responses of the primitive mind, and it is in this silence of thoughtfulness that we gain the wisdom of the mental coordinator. Now, the corollary opposite of the mental coordinator is the mental reactor, or the emotional center of the brain, which uses the most inferior type of logic, which is emotional logic. Now, the Greek word for emotion is pathos, and logic is logos. Therefore, emotional logic is by the very definition pathological, such as a pathological liar or a pathological fear of heights. And yes, pathology is a mental disease. Interestingly, the emotional part of your brain processes 5 times faster than your cognitive function. However, this is not because it is superior, but because it is required for the lower mind survival functions known as fight, flight, or freeze. It is also responsible for herd mentality, as we subconsciously recognize the value of safety in numbers. And the marketing industry, owned by the social constructivists, are all too familiar with the psychology of manipulating your mind. These corporate predators thrive on appealing to your primal wants and needs through something called strategic emotional marketing campaigns. Specifically, these corporate psychologists have found that most humans make decisions based off of a few core emotions, such as happiness, sadness, fear, and anger. And their research concludes that happiness equates to more shares, retweets, and links to friends, while sadness or negative words lead to a 63% higher click through rate. And headlines with the words such as worst or never have a 30% more effectiveness when it comes to grabbing your attention. Essentially, the tactic works like this. If the social constructivists can make you, the customer, feel sad and then promise you that they have the solution to do something about your negative feelings, they can rest assured that you'll be more likely to act. And in psychological terms, this is called the Hegelian dialectic. Now, fear and surprise. Fear prompts you to act through urgency and a desire for self-preservation, which sets the conditions for you to make a hasty decision. And a good example of this is the onslaught of climate change propaganda. Anger and disgust. Emotional marketing strategies use feelings of anger and disgust to shake you out of your stupor and into action. So when good yet naive people see an injustice in the world, they are naturally compelled to do something about it. And they also manipulate you through the psychology of color. Did you know that psychologists have confirmed that the right shades of color can alter your psychological, emotional, and behavior state? Some examples are blue equals trust and red equals excitement. Or that the psychology of content reveals that stories activate the parts of your brain that convince us that we're actually experiencing the story for ourselves through a scientific process called neural coupling, with the ultimate goal of getting your brain to release a shot of dopamine, quite literally making you a dopehead. Have you ever seen someone addicted to television? There are also entire marketing campaigns exclusively centered around user-generated content, which focuses on personalized propaganda such as testimonials and personal experiences. You really didn't think that all those rave reviews were genuine, did you? They even employ the tactic of embracing feelings of nostalgia in their campaigns, promoting an old TV series or a product pairing with a happy song familiar within the minds of the age demographic that they are attempting to capture. And if all else fails, sex always sells. And to carry all this out is the most god-awful propaganda machines ever invented, beginning with the television. In case you don't know, they call it programming for a reason. And now, with social media and the rise of the digital world, the propaganda has become magnified 1,000-fold. And how does it feel to know that you actually pay for the very tool that is brainwashing you, and it is right in the palm of your hand? And to carry this all through, it's all about repetition, 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 repetition. Now, the lesson on this slide is threefold. First, to give you a basic education in regard to just a few of the psychological tactics employed on you every day. Secondly, to raise your awareness that you should consciously guard your thoughts, which implies that you should guard the sensory input that feeds your thoughts, because predominant thought patterns eventually become manifested habits, and these habitual behaviors eventually become your character. And lastly, to offer a basic moral compass to you, perhaps best served by the mantra, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And yes, karma is very real. And you must know that the powers that be will always desperately cling to the paradigm that best serves them, and unfortunately to the detriment of all humanity. Thus, when you find certain truth, They will usually be met with a hyperbolic simplification used to marginalize the truth through some sort of denigration, which I call idea assassination, because it is assassinating the character of the idea, or if this can't be done, then assassinate the character of the person who has the idea, which is an informal fallacy called poisoning the well, where if they throw shade on you, then they can throw shade on your idea. And here are just a few examples that I can think of off the top of my head. Firstly, this idea assassination is very easily seen when it comes to infinite logic. A really good example of infinite logic is to take a standard inch and divide it in half, then divide that half in half, and so on and so forth. You can see that even though in reality it is in fact only 1 inch, there is also simultaneously an infinity held within that inch. In the ancient days, this pattern of thought was called infinite logic, but in our contemporary world, it has been relegated to the term fuzzy logic. Or how about in mathematics, where the most interesting numbers are the constants or infinite numbers, such as pi and tau and the golden ratio? Truly, they are hyper-rational, which means beyond rationality. But through marginalization, you get the term irrational applied to these numbers, as irrational means not rational, which takes on a negative connotation and subsequent subconscious mental relegation, although they did get the transcendental portion correct. And all the interesting things are in the world of hypermathematics, and yet somehow they are usually thrown into the marginalized mathematical pool called recreational mathematics, which gives it the connotation that it is not to be taken seriously, you see. Or in the world of science, where just because the scientists don't understand what 99% of DNA does, it gets relegated to the marginalizing term junk DNA. And a good understanding of the principle of cause and effect will ultimately lead you to the conclusion that everything is divinely timed, yet detractors will use the term chance or coincidence, or even in religion. People over the course of history have noticed, here we go, patterns within the world's myths, and the amalgamation of these are known as synchronicity. So, what do the disparagers do? Well, they do what they always do. They throw a negative spin on it by using terms such as cultural appropriation, which implies some sort of thievery and gives it the slight taste of selfishness. Do you see how words work? Do you understand that people who use these tactics are not intellectually honest, but in fact mental degenerates? Now, syncretism is a term specifically used in regard to religion, but it's loosely used in the realm of language as well because, well, there is no overall term for this phenomenon found within language. So I have coined the term metamology, which means beyond language. And this word fits perfectly into the area of academic study called metalogic or meta theory, whose goal is to derive truth about languages and systems that are used to express logic. So for now, I will shelve this particular topic as I plan to release a presentation all about meta language in the not so far future. And for an easy visual reference, here is what all of this looks like set within the allegorical context of Plato's cave, where you are the programmed. The false image on the wall is the projected program. The fire tenders are the programmers, and the fire they have socially constructed is the program. All the while, outside of the cave is the real reality, and the man standing outside of the cave is me, attempting to coax you out of the cave and deliver the message that I received from Q. Hello, Q, which is this: absolutely everything is light. So let us take a look at the metaphysical realm that you are absolutely certain exists, and it resides within you. Starting from the center of the diagram is you. Hi, you. And we're going to expand outward. Now, you think, which is the process of using thought. And thought is the foundation for logic, which is correct reasoning. And in turn, logic aims at knowledge. In other words, we use logic in order to obtain knowledge. In turn, knowledge is the aim of truth. In other words, we use knowledge in order to obtain truth. And the aim of truth is understanding, because we desire truth in order to understand. And the aim of understanding is wisdom, because wisdom allows you the ability to appropriately think and act. And the aim of wisdom is higher states of consciousness, because higher states of consciousness moves you closer to the source of yourself. And your consciousness is contained within your mind. In other words, your consciousness is your light, and your mind is the light bearer. And mind is in turn contained within all light, also known as absolutely everything and the creator of everything, to include the nothing, which exists both within it and outside of it, as nothing certainly exists outside of everything, that being the self begotten or self born one. Now that you know the hierarchical sequence within your inner world, the question becomes why? Why? And the answer is to grow. Well, then, we can ask the question what? Grow what? And the answer is, survey says, number one answer on the board, love. God desires to grow love because it is love. You are it and it is you. And from the dirty, filthy sinner to the most holy saint, listen to me. It loves you unconditionally, and that means without condition. And because it loves you unconditionally, it forgives you unconditionally. And forgiveness means that the hand of God or the hand of the Aten is always extended towards you. All you have to do is accept it. Now we have traversed a copious amount of information regarding the logos, and we can conclude that logos indeed means ground, word, plea, opinion, expectation, speech, account, discourse, reason, proportion, and ratio. And by deductive reason, we can also logically conclude that it means logic, mean, pattern, fractile, quotient, and yes, Q, hello Q. Now let's check ourselves by applying the knowledge we have gained to arguably the most relevant sentence ever written in regard to the Logos. And that sentence is found in John 1:1 of the New Testament, which states in original Greek, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with Tetragrammaton, and the Logos was Tetragrammaton. But in English, this has been transposed as in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, which is equally true. However, the following translations are also equally true and even more revealing of the truth given the context. Ask yourself, doesn't these translations make more sense now that you know? In the beginning was the pattern, and the pattern was with God, and the pattern was God. And as we know, God is the Father, or the Deus Pater, which is the Sky Father. Or, in the beginning was the fractal, and the fractal was with God, and the fractal was God. And what is a fractal other than a fraction from the mathematical point of view? And a fraction is defined as a ratio of a part to the whole. And the set of all numbers that can be expressed in the form of A over B is called the set of rational numbers, also called the quotient, mathematically identified by the symbol Q, high Q, or that the symbol for all rational numbers is, yet again, Q, high Q. And if you understand this, then you should completely understand this next and my personal favorite translation. In the beginning was Q, and Q was with God, and Q was God. Hello, Q. And you should find all this very interesting, considering that the letter Q is the least repeated letter in the English alphabet. And finally, a brilliant man once told me something that I took and stored deep within my heart, and I hope you do as well.